I'm gonna get rid of this man. Don't tell anyone. Uh-oh, I lost my hearing aid. Hold on. Door repair work.
Dave, I'm gonna move this, because I can't see you.
That's better. You wanna put this in front of you, in front of your mouth?
Yes, that's good right there for a moment.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. Well, I think most of the people in the room know who I am, but I'm Dave Kershaw. I was born and raised in Mount Ephraim, which is only a half-hour drive from here. I lived there until I was 18, went in the Army. When I come back, I settled just down the road here, 10 minutes away, in a place called Barnesboro. And I lived there with my family for 61 years. And then just prior to coming here, I had sold off everything I had and decided to come. I've had wonderful support from my 2 sons and daughters-in-law. And anytime I needed anything, fortunately, they were close enough. They took care of me right away. The program I have set up is different than you're accustomed to for several reasons. First of all, I have a microphone here. I'm not going to do any singing. I was a tenor once, and I sang in the barbershop chorus with 70 men. It was tremendous. But I had a bout with pneumonia a couple of years ago, and when the high fever got my voice, it never came back. So, but I'm going to use it in case I run out of voice here while I'm talking. My son and daughter-in-law set up a microphone here, so that's the purpose. I'm not going to do any singing. Couple of things I'd like to explain. First of all, I would prefer there be no applause after the song, because I have quite a number of songs involved, and it would save a little time if we can skip the applause. My program is based on the fact that my 2 sons and daughters-in-law gave me a book after I moved in here, and it's called Events That Shaped the Century. Now, the century involved is 1900 to 2000, 100 years. And it dawned on me that a good many people here now, and when I came, have lived through more than 3/4 of that particular century, when all of the action was taking place in terms of development of our country. So the book is kind of divided in 3 sections. One describes the automobile in 1900, and of course there were practically none. Henry Ford had not yet developed the Model T, and he didn't have the production line production. But once he got that rolling in early 1900s, everybody knows what happened. Now the automobile, of course, every decade has come through improvements, either in the tires, in the engines, and we've now jumped up to the point now where we are looking at electric vehicles. So that's where the automobile has gone in less than 100 years. The second section was on airplanes, and everybody remembers what the old airplanes you see, like the Wright brothers had. My first flight was right here in Pennsauken, there was an airport there called Central Airport. And now it's still referred to as the airport circle where it was.
Yeah.
But, it was a regular, airport carrying passengers, TWA. But they dropped, one of their passenger planes on Admiral Wilson Boulevard. And that was the end of that airport. That's when they decided to build the Philadelphia International Airport. But when you look at where the airplane has come in that short time, 100 years, 75 years, we are now flying to the moon and also to Mars apparently, and faster than the speed of sound. The third item in the book covered communication. In the early 1900s, there was practically no communication. There were no radios, no televisions, of course. And you look at what we have now, all of our communication now is occurring with satellites, and we are talking to people on the moon and and soon on Mars. And I thought I would look and see if there was anything about music, and there was nothing. So I thought to myself, I remember what music was like when I first started out in life and how it has progressed. And it kind of has sneaked up on us because originally there was classical music, of course, that the refugees brought in from Europe. And then there were church songs. And then we developed into the big bands. Everybody remembers the big bands. And now, of course, we're into different types of music again. So what I've done, I've set up the program here similar to one of the early television shows, and it was called Name That Tune. I don't know if everybody remembers that.
Oh, yeah.
The object was that they would play a few notes in the opening of the song, and then whoever guessed the title of the song or guessed the song itself won prizes. So what I've set up here, I will play each song. I'll explain the songs and then play them, sometimes maybe twice if they're short songs. And then I'll ask for a show of hands from anybody who recognizes the song. And then I will ask who knows the title, and everybody can shout out if you want. Some of the songs I'm quite sure you will remember, and if you care to sing along, that's fine, because we're not going to be having a choir here or anything, but if you want to get some music, why, be my guest. So with that, let's see where we go. My mother was a church soloist before she was married. She sang at church in Philadelphia. Then when she was married, she continued, but then along came 3 boys, one after another, 4 years apart. But so that was the end of her career as a soloist. But she continued singing. We had an upright piano at home. My mother continued to sing. She sang at local events. She sang at the weddings and other ceremonies. So I was exposed to music almost from the day I opened my eyes. My older son, she was hoping he was going to be interested in music, but he was interested in sports, and he wanted basketball and baseball. So that went down the drain. My second son, who was 4 years behind, he thought girls were more fun than music. So I think he dated every girl in his senior high school class and went steady with just about every one of them, one at a time, of course. So I was the only possibility left. But my mother did notice that I was interested in music, and especially the songs that she was singing. There were no songs anywhere else. There was still no radio or any television. So she asked me when I was 10 years old if I would like to try taking piano lessons, which I did. And anyone here has taken piano lessons, it can be frightening because once a year they have what they call a recital, where you're supposed to show off all the skills that you develop. More than one of them would get up ready to start to play and leap up and run out the door crying. But I stuck it out. So 1901 was really the start of music here, because the greatest immigration in this country took place between 1880 and 1920. In that time period, there were over 5 million immigrants came through New York City. Sounds familiar, doesn't it, right now, this day and age? But they brought the music in from Europe, of course. But the interesting thing about it was when I was getting older and starting school, all of a sudden, all the big bands were going into operation, and I thought it was strange. They all came out at the same time. I'm talking about Benny Goodman and yeah, some of the others. But it wasn't so strange after all. As soon as the immigrants hit the United States, they began having children immediately because they wanted them to be American citizens. So that was not a coincidence. But anyhow, the first song I'll play is was one of the wedding songs that was popular. I suspect some of you might recognize it even now. And if you do, please hold on until I ask for hands.
Beautiful.
And what was the name? Everybody.
I love you truly.
I love you truly.
I love you truly.
Yeah. Now that was appropriate because that was written in 1901, so it was really the first song that is on record as having been written here in the New World. Another song that my mother was constantly singing for the obvious reasons. Because. Now, that was written in 1902, so that one fit right into my schedule also. Now, here's another one that doesn't quite fit the timeline, but I'll play it anyway. Everybody recognize that one?
The old rugged cross.
The Old Rugged Cross. Yeah, I'm surprised, with these so far. And I'm a bit disappointed, and I'll tell you why. When I set up this program, I was planning to present $100 gifts to each of the heads of each section. And last week, I got a call from the Gaming Commission in Trenton telling me that if I were to award $100 bills like that, that would be considered gambling. And they advised me that New Jersey does not condone gambling at all. So therefore, I would be in serious legal problems. Somebody just murmured they're glad they didn't list the slot machines as gambling, because otherwise we'd all be in trouble. Then there was a birth of modern musicians that I described, all of whom were born in that same time zone. 1907 was the largest immigration in the history of our country. There were 1.5 million immigrants in 1 year. And of course, among them were the modern band leaders who turned out that way later. The first what was considered the big band was a gentleman called Paul Whiteman.
Oh, yeah.
Many people here remember Paul Whiteman?
Yeah.
Well, he assembled such a band. It was huge, and a lot of the members in that band were guys like Tommy Dorsey and Jimmy Dorsey and what's the name on the clarinet, and the drummer. And it turned out that the band was so big that they didn't travel. They were somewhere in New York, one of the big hotels, I think. But that's where the big bands really started. But then the problem came up. The war was going on now, starting in Europe. And that kind of slowed things down. We attempted to keep the music going in this country, but it looked like Great Britain was gonna be invaded because Hitler had conquered all of the Europe in his area. So Roosevelt and Churchill met on a battleship in the Atlantic Ocean. Nobody knew where they were. And Roosevelt suggested that we could lend him 40 or 50 destroyers that we had left from World War I. That way we could stay neutral as a country, because we weren't giving them to them, we were lending them to them. They called the Lend-Lease program. So that went well. And then Roosevelt heard about a young singer that he thought would be popular if he could travel around the country. The idea was to raise money, again, to help the British without going to war. Now, the young lady, I'll play you her song first. And who was the lady?
Kate Smith.
That's right. And for the sake of you Philadelphia people, that was the same Kate Smith that became the
Flyers.
The Flyers.
She was involved with the Flyers.
Yeah.
Somebody noticed every time Kate sang in the opening, they won the game. So they adopted her as their mascot, and lo and behold, they won the Stanley Cup. And the next year they did it again, and one of the few teams that ever won twice in a row. So immediately, of course, Kate Smith became popular. But the biggest thing with Kate Smith was that she traveled all over the country, and Roosevelt appointed her as America's sweetheart and songbird. So the British liked the idea. So they decided they would have a British songbird, and they called her the British Kate Smith. Now, you may or may not remember the songs. I'm sure you don't remember her, but I will. I have a few of her songs here. All of the songs in England at that point, England had been blasted for 2 years by the Germans. Day and night they were bombed. So that all of the songs that were coming out of England were all sad songs representing the separation between the men who had to go into the army, and a lot of whom weren't even given time enough to get married. But this was one of her theme songs. Anybody? Oh. Do you know who the lady was? I wouldn't expect it because she was British. It was a young lady named Vera Lynn. and she became the British Kate Smith, they called her. And that particular song was entitled "Now Is the Hour," and that's because everybody was getting ready to go to war, or was in war in England. So all of the sad songs were coming out. Here was another one. That was also with Vera Lynn. How about that? We'll meet again.
Yes.
Vera Lynn.
I have it back. I was up there.
And here was another one of hers. Oh, incidentally, the name of that, I think I did say was We'll Meet Again. Again, it was involved with the separation of two lovers or even two married people that were being separated.
We'll meet again. I don't know what the title is. Some sunny day.
That was it. For all we know, we may never meet again.
Yeah.
And again, it was the separation of either lovers or married people, or many times the people would be planning on getting married and suddenly they were gone. About that time, our country was, of course, the dark cloud was coming toward us. We knew there was a war coming. We didn't know exactly when, so Congress started a draft. I forget how the technical term will come to me if I wait long enough. But anybody between the age of 18 and 28 was eligible for the draft, and what that meant, well, and it was conscription, that's what they called. Became eligible for the draft, and what they did, they had a large plastic, looked almost like a cement mixer, and in that cement mixer was the date of every day of every month of that particular year, and it had to be around 36, 37. What would happen is every Friday there would be some celebrity, Hollywood, somebody perhaps a ball player, but somebody would reach in and pull out a number. Now that number would be a date, a day. And every person in the United States who recognized that as their birthday were immediately eligible for military service. No ifs, ands, or buts. The next step then would be, within a week or so, they would get a nice letter from the War Department stating that their number had been chosen and they were now given 3 days to get their act together and then to report to the local military establishment. Now in this case, it was Fort Dix, New Jersey, which is where we went. And Fort Dix is still there and they're still training recruits. But every week, and sometimes they pick more than one, depending upon what the military could handle. But we then decided to have some of our own songs now begin to sound somewhat like the British. So I'll play a couple of our songs now.
I'll be seeing you.
Hey, very good. You got some winners here. You can't win anything, but you're a winner. Boy, you'd be walking home in a while.
I love it.
Sorry about that. But they weren't all sad songs. There were some others coming up. Everybody knows that one.
Sidewalks, I like to go.
Sidewalks of New York. Now, seems there was a gentleman that I knew, and he had his own business, and he worked hard, never took vacations, never got married, and he devoted his entire life to his business. And when it came time to retire, he was lonely. He had no one, no family, and he was depressed, so his friend said, why don't you go on the internet and see about getting a wife? They're laughing. Well, he didn't know much about the internet, but he said he would post something that night. So he did, and he only thought of 2 words, and it said, wife wanted. That's what he posted. And he thought maybe when he woke up in the morning there would be maybe a couple contacts. Well, when he woke up in the morning there were over 100 contacts in his mailbag. And he started reading them, and they were all exactly the same. And they all said, take my wife. Now, I was 16. I was not eligible yet for the draft, but I knew they were breathing on me, so I was called by the church. And I had been playing, I had been playing piano in the church with my mother. I would accompany her when she sang some of these songs. But I got a hurry-up call from the church in Mount Ephraim asking me would I come and play the organ. Well, it turns out that the organist was a man. They always had men then in the organs. And he was going in the draft. And the whole town now, I was the only one that was still not eligible for the draft. And I said I never played an organ, and that didn't make any difference. So they hired me, and well, they didn't hire me, you know, I played, but I was awful. I made so many mistakes, but they loved me because at least they had music for their next service anyway. And about that time, I got a call from a friend that I had been in Audubon High School with. He had left school and joined the Marines. And he was in New York getting ready to be shipped to the West Coast to go to the South Pacific. And he asked me would I meet him in New York for the day, maybe we could reminisce about the old days and the high school days and so forth. I said, sure. He said, I'll meet you in front of the, oh my goodness, the big music hall.
Radio City.
No. Oh, I knew this was going to happen.
Carnegie Hall.
The what?
Carnegie Hall.
Carnegie Hall, thank you. Meet me in front of Carnegie Hall, and I said, okay. I'd never been to New York, and I got on the bus. I couldn't ride a train because at that point, the military had grabbed every railroad in the country. And the only people that used the railroad, they used them for troop movements and for military equipment. There were no civilian railroads at all. So I rode the bus to New York and I got out and I'm busy getting a stiff neck looking at all these big buildings, and I didn't have the slightest idea where Carnegie Hall was. So I saw a policeman in the middle of the intersection, and he was directing traffic. And I stepped down off the curb and went across the street, and he said, "What do you want?" I said, "Can you tell me how to get to Carnegie Hall?" And he stopped all the traffic, and he stepped back and looked me up and down like he said, practice, practice, Now here's a couple songs. That's true, that's one. This is one of the few I found that has two possibilities. In the Garden is the main one, where also He Walks With Me is listed in some of the hymnals. And can everybody hear okay here?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, then I don't have to use the microphone.
No.
That's just Prince of England was just buried, 2 weeks ago. And Daddy played that on bagpipes.
Oh, wow.
And that's quite a service.
Yeah.
And we're still on some of the separation songs. Here was one. By separation, I mean there were guys, and as I said, who were hoping to be married, and when you get a 3-day notice from the government, all your plans go down the drain right away, so.
Like that, Dave.
Everybody knows
Sails
that.
in the sunset.
Red
Red
sails.
sails of the sunset?
That's it. Another $100.
What's positive though?
Now, I wasn't going to be outdone. So I proceeded to write a song. And I had it arranged by a gentleman in Gloucester, New Jersey. His name was Rodano, who had written several songs that made it to the hit parade. So I thought maybe you'd like to hear my version. This isn't for sale. I'm not gonna stand in the lobby and try to sell them like they do in some of these places. And I only have one copy, so I can't sell them. But this is one. Now this again represented a boy and a girl who were planning, and it didn't work. Let me see where yeah. I want to ask a title for this because the title was So Little Time. And that was based on the fact that 3 days wasn't enough time.
Very nice.
I had one request before I had worked out this whole theme, so I will play that request. Anybody know that one? No? It was called Jean, Jean, You're Young and Alive. Well, it was a very popular one. Now, I have a couple of the modern ones that don't fit my time, but I love them. And I will play the first one, which I think was, well, it was one of the prettiest, if not the prettiest. But, I think you will recognize this one. Wonderful, wonderful.
So good. Beautiful.
Here's another one that I think you'll know.
I just wanted to stop. No, I have, I've been here today.
expert. Believe it or not, that was one of the biggest hits of Perry Como,
Oh.
called Feeling. There was another one that you may remember, but it was, strangely enough, it was a German army song at one time. Anyone know that one? That was called Lily Marlene. It was a British, it was a German army song. And Marlene Dietrich, I would assume most of us knew who she was. She was German, but when she saw what was happening to Germany, she moved to France. And she became a French citizen. But then when the Germans conquered France, she was right back in the soup again because now she was entertaining the German soldiers in France. But everybody suspected that she was a spy because she was moving back and forth, but they could never figure out who she was working for and who she was spying on. But I had seen her in Paris after the war, and I was shocked because she was, I would have thought she was about 80, 85 years old, but she was born in 1910, so she wasn't that old, but I guess all the traveling around. She eventually came to the United States, and I think she died here. Now, we were getting ready for World War II, of course, although we all know how we got into that war, but after Pearl Harbor, it was decided again by Roosevelt and Kershaw that even though we were now in the war and declared the war, that there would be an invasion that would have to take place in France in 3 years. So what they began doing, they began sending all of the troops, including myself, to England, and England was getting flooded with the Yanks, as they called us. And of course, every pub was loaded with the Yanks, and every movie theater was loaded with the Yanks, with the British girls. So radio now was in its infancy, but it was functional. And there was a broadcaster in London that decided he wanted to go out and check with the British people themselves and see what they thought, because there were between 5 and 6 million GIs alone. And then there were sailors, and there were pilots, army pilots, bomber pilots. So he took his microphone out on the sidewalk like they do here, and he stopped the first Brit that he saw coming down, an elderly gentleman, and he said, "What do you think about the Americans here?" He said, they're in all the pubs. The man said, "I don't like it. I don't like it a bit." He said, "Well, what don't you like?" He said, "Well, the biggest problem is," he said, "they're overpaid." And the announcer thought, well, that's probably true. They did make more than the British soldiers, which meant the British soldiers were kind of in the background. So he thought, well, he asked another man, so the second man came along. And he said, what do you think about all these Yanks who are crowding the movie theaters with all the British women? He said, I don't like it at all. And he said, well, what don't you like? He said, they're oversexed. And the announcer thought, well, he probably has a point. He said, a lot of these guys have been here for 2 and 3 years. And a lot of them were married, and a lot of them had girlfriends. And so he said, maybe I ought to ask one more. So along came another Brit, and he asked him, he said, what do you think of the Americans being here? He said, I don't like it a bit. He said, well, what don't you like about it? He says, they're over here. And that was written up in the newspaper, so I assumed that it was, what's the time?
Just about 4.
4 o'clock? Well, that worked out quite well, because I still have a few more tunes. They had very kindly and politely asked me would I like to play again next month. And what I'm doing now in preparation, the big bands had just come into their own, and dancing now in high school was very, very popular. And if there was not going to be a football game on the next Saturday, on Friday afternoon, they would close the school and open a gymnasium, and we used to dance to the band music. They had what was called a Victrola, which we knew would play all the records. And then there were a series of movies that came out with Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. And it always involved teenagers who were sitting around moping, nothing to do. And then Judy would always say to Mickey, how about if we go to my house and we'll roll up the carpets and we'll dance in my living room because I have a Victrola, I can play these records. Now, believe it or not, that's where we learned to dance. Anybody else experience that in high school?
Yes.
Yeah. And we did roll up the rock. The only thing that bothered me was that at that age, the teenage boys, and myself included, were kind of klutzy. But the girls, they were women, and they had to teach us how to dance. But what bothered me was that how did they learn in the first place? But it really happened that way, and that's how we all learned to dance. And so my next section I'm working on is the big band era, which was just really getting off the ground when the draft came along. And of course, all of the band members and the band leaders themselves were all eligible for the draft.
Right.
So that was the end of the big band era. And then there was a comeback after the war, but the kind of the what do they say, something was going off the road. So then there were singers that broke off who had been band singers who now went on their own. People like Frank Sinatra and Perry Como and many of the others. So I'm working up another program now to pick up at the beginning of the war. There were war songs, of course, written by Irving Berlin mainly. And so if you'd like to hear some more, why, yeah, that's the plan. I hope you've enjoyed today. It's I was asking for that, and I'll accept it. Thank you very much. Yeah, I thought it would be a little different than what we have here, and we also have some real professionals here that come in from outside, and I wasn't about to try to compete with any of them because they were very, very good.
Actually, you might have been better than some.
I'm sorry, I
You
can.
might have been better than some of them.
Yes.
Really.
I thank you for that. I'll take that as a compliment.
Take it, and you know what? Maybe you could do some Broadway songs. Some songs